Hello, my name is Colin, and in this video we'll be looking at how to render out an animation that you've created in Blender 2.8 out from Blender to a video file on your computer, complete with animation and lighting and shadows. It'll be a movie file that you can watch on your computer or even upload to a streaming service like YouTube. So in this video, we'll learn how to take your 3D animation and make a video file out of it. Of course, if you like this video or if you learned something, please go ahead and click on that like button below this video. It really helps me in my channel out. And if you want to see more videos like this one in Blender 2.8 or in the Godot game engine, click on that subscribe button as well and click on the bell icon to be notified whenever I upload a new tutorial. So for this video, I'm actually going to be giving you a file to download if you want to follow along with me. I'm giving you this simple scene of a round floor, a red bouncy ball, a light that's set up, and a camera that's positioned. And our scene is actually set up here so that under the camera tab, under the settings for your render, we've actually turned on some of the settings that will make the scene look better. If you're not familiar with how to set up a scene in Blender or how to add objects or some of the features of the new Eevee render engine in Blender 2.8, I'll put a link to this Blender 2.8 tutorial series on the screen right now. There's been 5 videos so far, including some of the new tricks and techniques of how to use the new Eevee render engine. In the last video though, we learned how to create animation. So if you have not checked out that video, I would recommend that you pause this video, go check out that video, for which I'll have a link on the screen right now, because we're going to make this ball bounce. To make this ball bounce, I'm going to add a couple of keyframes. I'll make my timeline editor a little bit taller. I'm going to add a keyframe on frame 1 in my timeline and on frame 60, and we're going to use a special interpolation effect. So to make animation, I'm going to turn on my auto keying button. I'm going to go to frame 1 in my timeline. The auto keying button will insert a keyframe of the object that I move or rotate or scale at whatever keyframe or frame I'm on in my timeline. So I'm going to grab my move tool. I'm going to move the ball straight up to about there. Looks good. When you let go, when you have the record button turned on or the auto keying button turned on, you get a little keyframe. I'm going to go to frame 60 and I'm going to move the ball straight down. In fact, I'm going to go and click on this little green circle in this axis here. The green circle will get me to the front view in my scene. There we go, front view. And now I can move the ball straight down and know when it hits the ground. So now I have 2 keyframes, a start, which is higher up, and an end on frame 60. It doesn't look like it's bouncing though. I could take time to animate this and space it out and make sure it all looks realistic, but there's a shortcut. If I click on the first keyframe, in fact, I'm going to press Alt-A with my mouse down here. Alt-A will deselect all. Then I can click on the first keyframe to just select it. With the first keyframe selected, if I press the T key on my keyboard, it'll bring up the set keyframe interpolation. Your mouse has to be down here, T, and then I'm going to choose the dynamic effect called bounce. Bounce will automatically give it a bouncing animation. Look at that. There is no squash and stretch. So if I play it, it looks like it's a very hard, like a bowling ball that wouldn't squash or stretch a lot. But there you go. I find that it doesn't quite hit the ground properly. At least not on the first bounce for some reason, but I'm okay. If we look through our camera, we can see it, and it'll be good enough for the sake of this video. If you want to see how that animation looks with that bounce effect, you could split your timeline up into 2. I could grab my timeline at the top right corner, drag it over, change this editor into, using this button, the editor type button, to a graph editor. And now you can see what that bounce effect does. It automatically creates this set of curves in your Z-axis of that selected object, assuming you already have 2 keyframes. You can't adjust these very well, but it's a fun little effect. Okay, so we're going to render out this to a video file. If I go up to render, the menu at the top, and say render animation, that's how you do it. But if you were to do this, it would not give you the result that you want, because the default output format in Blender is a still image file. That means if you render out your timeline, well, you're going to get your whole timeline, in this case 250 frames, and it'll just be a bunch of picture files in whatever the default location is. So if I go over to my properties editor and I go to the output tab, which looks like a little printer, before I even think about rendering, I need to set some settings up. I should know what my output resolution is, the pixels size, left and right and up and down. The default is 1920 by 1080, which is good because that's a common video format. It's called 1080p, also known as Full HD. Other common video compatible video size formats are available under dimensions. So it's the little preset button and you can choose one that works for you. There is 720p HDTV. That's good for lower quality, but still semi-high definition YouTube videos. There is 2160p, which is called 4K or ultra high definition. It's up to you. 1080p is okay for basic projects in 2019, 2020 or so. You should know where your animation starts and where it ends. Ours only goes for 60 frames, although I'm gonna end my animation at 80 frames. So I'll just type in 80 there, and when you change it here, it changes it in your timeline settings as well, okay? You should also know, of course, your frame rate, 24 frames per second is fine. It's pretty standard. You might want to choose 25 if you're outputting for television in Europe. If you're outputting for television in North America, it's 29.97. 24 is sort of a happy medium for the internet. It's more like traditional film. Next, we have to think about our output format. And if you want to output to a bunch of still images, you can leave it on PNG. And we'll actually talk about why you might want to do that a little bit later. But if you want a video file, you'll want to select under Output, File Format. There's lots of image file formats. There are a few video options, but the one you'll want to pick is called FFmpeg Video. FFmpeg is actually a separate open source video encoding program that had nothing to do with Blender up until a few years ago, when Blender, I think for version 2.79, decided to integrate this separate video encoder program, because it was so good, into Blender to replace what Blender used to have. So if you select FFmpeg Video, it's not one kind of video, it's a whole sub-program that when you select it, you can expand this new encoding section. It's a subsection when you only have that one selected, and you get lots of video settings. Now I'm going to break these apart into 3 sections, as Blender does. There is a section for the container. The container of your video is essentially the wrapper of the video file. It dictates a few things, including the file extension of the video. In other words, do you want a QuickTime movie file that ends in .mov? That's the file extension. Or do you want an AVI, a .avi, or a .mp4, or a .ogg, or a .fla, an old Flash video file? You can choose the container, the wrapper, the file extension for your video file here. I'm going to select, because it's the most common these days, MP4 or MPEG-4. Next up are the video and audio codecs. A codec is an algorithm for compressing a stream of media like video frames or an audio sequence or sound in your animation. A video codec, common ones might include H.264. That's the most common these days. There's also HUF-YUV, DivX, also known as MPEG-4. There's many, many more. Again, the most common these days is probably H.264. So I'm going to select that one. That's what YouTube uses. That's what most streaming video services use these days. It's also what Blu-ray discs use as well. Audio codecs include AAC, which is the most common these days, AC3 and MP3. You've probably heard of MP3 before, but again, the most common these days is AAC. These are all just names that correspond to different ways of compressing that stream of information. And when you have a video file with a container, it has 2 streams, an audio stream and a video stream, and they're both compressed differently, but the video file plays them back at the same time, hopefully in sync. If you don't want to think about all those things, you can use an encoding preset. Once you've selected FFmpeg video, you can go to encoding, click on the little preset button, and I would suggest that you use H.264 in MP4. It's by far the most common these days. So I'll select that. When you click on one of these presets, it doesn't hide this window, it just changes your things down here. If you select something like Xvid, it'll change a bunch of things. If you select H.264 and MP4, it'll change a lot. Other than that, you might want to think about changing the quality. In video, there's a bunch of default quality presets: medium quality, lossless, low quality. It's up to you. And in audio, there's bitrate, and the default's 192, which is fine. You could change it up to 256 if you like, although 192 is just fine in my opinion. So we're almost there, except for one minor detail. Where are we saving this video file? That's under the very top, under the output section in your output tab. This temp folder is not where you want to go. So I'm going to press the folder button, and in Blender 2.81, this is a new feature compared to 2.80. You get this new pop-up save dialog box, and it looks more familiar as compared to other programs that you've ever used that aren't Blender. You get a bottom bar, which is where you put your file name. The top bar is where you currently are on your computer. There are, of course, shortcuts along the side. It might be hidden by default. There's a little arrow to show this sidebar. I'm going to go to my desktop. I'm going to save this file as bouncing ball v1 dash. And I'm putting a dash at the end because when you output directly to a video file, it will add the frame numbers to the end of the video file, which is a little bit annoying, but it does that. I'm not sure how to turn that off. So if you put a little dash there, it'll hopefully work a little bit better and be easier to read. So I'm going to press accept. And now all I have to do is go up to render and animation, and it'll make a movie file on my desktop. But hold on a second. Why are we making our video file have an audio codec when we don't have sound? Well, Blender doesn't have sound unless you add it. So on my desktop, I've got a MP3 file of a little piece of music called Mr. Turtle, which is a free music file that you can get if you Google YouTube Creator Audio Library, and you look up how to get free, royalty-free music for online purposes that you don't have to pay for. This is Mr. Turtle. Okay, that was Mr. Turtle. I'm going to go ahead now and add Mr. Turtle, this music file, Mr. Turtle, into our Blender animation before we even export or render from Blender into a video file. We can do that because Blender actually has a video editor built in. Now, if you're using a default Blender project, chances are you don't have one of these workspaces that's available to you, window layouts with presets for video editing. But if you press this little plus up here at the end of these workspace tabs, you can select video editing. I'm not sure why there's two there. I guess there's two options there. So video editing, and you get a new workspace which has Blender's video editor, which is called the sequencer. And there's two types of sequencers. There's the window is actually called video sequencer, and there's two of them, but then there's two modes, the sequencer and the preview window, which is the video. And in the sequencer, or the timeline, this is basically a timeline for a video editor. You've got a playhead, you can add video strips in, and you can add audio strips in, and you can just use this as a video editing program. If I go up to, in the timeline part of the sequencer, up to add, and I add in a sound, I can go to my desktop and find that Mr. Turtle MP3, and I'll add that sound strip, and it'll add it to wherever, or to start wherever my playhead is. This display is kind of weird. I don't like it. This displays your timeline in, or your sequencer in seconds. So this is 3 seconds here. I don't like that. I'm going to go up to view and uncheck show seconds. So now it shows me my frame numbers. And in fact, I want to see the waveforms of the audio. So if I go to view, waveform display, waveforms on, Now I can see the waveform display. I also want to move this strip down to the beginning to frame 1. So I'm going to click on it, tap G for grab, and I'll move it down and I'll click once it says 1 at the beginning. Okay. I'm not going to bother trimming this audio file because it'll just stop when the render stops, because we've got our end frame set to 80. So if I go back now with my sound in my sequencer timeline to lay out my original workspace, I want to make sure that under the output tab, under the bottom section called post-processing down here, if I open it up and scroll down, I want to make sure sequencer is checked, because when you have this checked, it'll use things from that sequencer timeline in your final render. And if you just have sound there, it'll render out the sound with your 3D scene render. Okay, get it? Good. Let's go ahead and go up to render animation, and it's going to render out, and I'll speed this part of the video up. Okay, so it's finished rendering out all 80 frames. I can now close this render window. I might do a Control S to save on my Blender, and then I'll minimize Blender. And on my desktop, I've got Bouncing Ball version 1-0001 to 0080. Those are my frame numbers, and it did it nicely because I put a dash at the end of the name. And now if I double click on it, it'll open up in whatever media software I have set as default for .mp4 files. I'm using VLC, which is a very common movie playing software for both Windows and Mac. I'm not sure about Linux, but it's very common. If you double click on the video file now, okay, the name of the file will display in VLC at the bottom, but it's not actually in the video file. So as you can see now, if I mute the audio and press play, we've got our rendered out animation, and it looks and hopefully sounds good. But you probably actually do not want to render out directly to a video file from Blender. Why? Why would you not want to render out to a video file? Well, chances are you're rendering out something that takes longer than this bouncing ball animation. This bouncing ball animation only took my computer about a minute to render out using the Eevee render engine. But if you have a more complex scene with more lighting setup, and perhaps you're not using the new Eevee render engine, which is very fast, perhaps you're using cycles and every frame takes a long time, chances are there's a good chance your computer might not work as expected for as long as it takes to render out every frame. And if your computer crashes, or just Blender crashes, or your computer turns off, or you want to use your computer for something else in the middle of rendering, well, you don't want to be stuck with half of a video file or a partial video file and have to start all over again. So I actually suggest that you render out to a folder of still images on your computer, and then take those still images, every frame, that are numbered automatically frame by frame as image files, and then stitch those together into a video file. When you do it this way, you can not only save yourself time by avoiding interruptions when computers or when Blender crashes, you can also use multiple computers to render out different sequences of frames and then put those all together into one sequencer in Blender. And if you're lucky enough to be on a computer network with a shared folder between multiple computers, you can actually render out from two computers to the same network folder, and the two computers will actually skip each other's files, and they'll just render all the files that you need into one folder and not duplicate any work. It's great. So let me show you how to set that up. If I go now in the same file, we've already got our animation. I got to turn off my record button. I always forget to do that. I'm going to go through my animation. There it is. And what I'm going to do now is go to my output tab. Instead of choosing under output a FFMPEG video file format, I'm going to select either JPEG or PNG. These are both the most common kinds of image files. Many people would not recommend that you use either of these. Many people suggest that you use TIFF images, but these two, JPEGs and PNGs, are very common, and they're compressed image file formats. JPEGs, I would not recommend. They are the most common and standard, I would say, kind of image file format, but they are compressed, and that's good, but the compression that JPEG images use is called lossy. Lossy means that it loses quality the more you compress the JPEG image. So you get what are called artifacts which make your image look worse. The nice thing about JPEGs is that you can shrink or compress the image into a smaller file size, and therefore you save storage space. So if you're saving out to a folder of images on a solid state drive that doesn't have much space, well, you might want to choose JPEG and leave the quality at about 90 or 95%. I recommend saving out to PNG images, which are still compressed. They're still fairly small file sizes, not compared to JPEGs, but they're still pretty small. But PNGs are lossless. That means they have lossless compression. You do not get artifacts. The quality is still great, and they're still compressed. And PNGs also support transparency. So if you want to composite still images that have a transparent area over top of another video or a sequence of images, you can do that later. We're not going to cover that in this video though. I'm going to select PNG as my file format output type. With PNGs, you don't get very many settings. You can select RGBA if you want an alpha channel. That's what the red, green, blue alpha means. In this case, we don't want that alpha, which means transparency. So I'll just go with red, green, and blue. If you are rendering out to a network folder from two computers, this is what you do. You uncheck overwrite. You do not want each computer to overwrite the image file that the other computer just rendered out. If you're rendering out from the same file on two computers, well, you want them to skip or leapfrog over the frame that the other one is rendering and go to the next frame automatically. This will do half of that job. The other thing you need to do is check placeholders. When you check placeholders, what it does is when a copy of Blender on your network starts rendering a frame, it will put a dummy picture file in the output folder, in your folder that you create where both computers are rendering out to, or all computers are rendering out to. And so all the other computers will see that dummy picture file and go, oh, I'm not going to overwrite that. I'm going to skip over that, and it'll go and render out, or they will go render out the next frame or frames in the sequence of frames for your animation. So uncheck overwrite, check placeholders, and you should be good. But we're rendering out to still images in a folder, and we're going to have to make that folder now. So I'm going to press the folder button next to output. I'm going to go to my desktop. On my desktop, I'm going to make a new folder with this little new folder plus button. I'm going to call it bouncing ball frames v2. And I'm happy with that. So I'll press enter, and I'm going to go into that folder now. I'll double click. And so now this is where all the images will be saved. I don't want to give these images any name because it'll automatically name, as Blender renders out these images to their frame number as the file name. So 0001.png, 0002.png, and so on and so forth. So if I press accept right now, inside that folder, that's where they will go. Let's go ahead now and render these out. I've still got my resolution set. I've still got my frames 1 to 80, my frame rate, and PNG. And let's go ahead and render out this animation again. Okay, it's finished rendering out. Let's go ahead and check out that folder of PNG images on my desktop. Here it is. If I double click to go in it, there they are. There's my folder of still image files, all numbered. In Blender now, I'm going to make a new project. So I'm going to save this Blender file, Control S to save. I'm going to go up to File, New, and I'll select a video editing template for Blender. This is new in 2.8. You don't have to make a general 3D new file in Blender or project. You can go up to File, New, and say, I want to make a video editing project, and it'll give you a different list of workspaces and a different default workspace. In this case, hey, this is for video editing. It's good. We don't even have a 3D viewport. That's fine. I'm going to go now to my sequencer. You've seen this before, basically. I'm going to go up to Add on the header of the sequencer timeline. Add. This time I'm going to select image/sequence. I want to bring in a sequence of images. On my desktop, I'm going to go into that folder we just rendered out to, Bouncing Ball Frames version 2. Here are all of my images. I'm going to press A with my mouse in here. We'll select all, and I'll select Add Image Strip when they're all selected. And it'll add a video strip, but it's actually a bunch of images in a row in a sequence, and it'll auto-detect what order they should go in based on their file name. So here we are, we've got this strip. Let's go ahead and change the view to uncheck show seconds. I'm also going to bring in my sound file. So under add, I'll bring in the sound file, Mr. Turtle, from my desktop, and add sound strip. My playhead was here at 57, so I'll select it, I'll click on it, tap G, move the strip down to start at frame 1, and there we go. Let's go ahead now and change. This is a new file, so I have to make sure my resolution is the same as my outputted PNGs, which was 1920 by 1080. I want to make sure my end frame is at 80, just like my frames. The frame rate should be at what I want it, which is 24. And I'm going to set the output location and use a video file again. So under output and file format, I'm going to select FFMPEG video, and under encoding, I'm just going to pick a preset here, H.264 and MP4, and I'll leave almost everything the same. But when you use a preset, it actually does not give any audio. So I'm going to select AAC as my audio codec. That should work great. So I think I'm good. I've got my audio and video. Again, if I want to see the waveform of my audio, I can go up to view and waveform displaying and waveforms on, and there they are. I don't have to worry about trimming anything because it'll end at frame 80. I'll go up now to, well, where are we outputting to? I'm going to go to my folder button and go to my desktop. I'm going to call this Bouncing Ball version 2, and I'll just rename this file to version 2. When you render out from the sequencer, it does not add the frame numbers like when you render out from a 3D file. I've discovered, I'm not sure why. So I'll press accept, and now I will go up to render animation, and that's done. It does not take very much time for Blender to render out frames of a movie file if you already have them rendered from PNG images. It's not like rendering from 3D. You're just taking picture files and putting them into a video file. Let's go ahead and see where we are. If I go to my desktop, I've got a movie file. I'm gonna play it. Okay, there is the finished video file, rendered out pretty much exactly the same, but we had an intermediate step of going out to a folder of PNG images. I suggest that you render out your animations that way and then convert them into a video. That's the better way to go. But that will be it for this video. Of course, if you like this video or if you learned something in it, please go ahead and click on that like button below this video. It really helps me and my channel out. And if you want to see more videos like this one in Blender 2.8 or using the Godot game engine, click on that subscribe button as well, and click on the bell icon to be notified whenever I upload a new tutorial. Also, check out my Facebook page at facebook.com/borncg. On that page, I post sneak peeks and previews of what I'm working on next, and it's where I communicate with you guys the most. But that'll be it for this video. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.